Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. You're watching the Ember Roundtable. Ember is a locals-born think tank focused on opening up discussions on principles that help inspire generations to come. All ideas must become ember before they grow into magnificent flames. What we're doing here is opening up discussions on tough political and social topics. It's a new venture for all of us, but we are starting out by having monthly recorded discussions about different topics. If you haven't listened to our first discussion, which was just a broad introduction video to the people on this panel, please go check it out at ember.locals.com. Here we go, discussion number 2. But before we begin, let's introduce everyone. I am Kevin of Engineering Politics. I'm a conservative content writer. No, it's not hopefully as boring as it sounds, but I try to have interesting discussions with plenty of different people who agree with me and don't agree with me on different topics, and kind of give my where I stand from a more conservative, right wing, kind of standing. So, I try to do my best to be open and honest, and I'm not here to convert anyone. I'm just here to, basically speak my piece and maybe, convince some people to move more toward the middle. Then we have Dr. Karlyn Borysenko. Doctor, tell us about yourself and what you do.
Yes, I'm an organizational psychologist, but more recently I complain on the internet. I was a Democrat for 20 years, turned independent. I think people on both sides are crazy, and I just want to have discussions about common sense.
That's a doctorate degree right there, already earned. So good. So good. Truman of Return to Reason. Truman, tell us about yourself and what you do.
My name is Truman. I run a lifestyle blog, and I've written over 10,000 entries on Wikipedia about mollusks. So I don't know what I'm doing here. No, I
wrong Truman. Sorry, I have a few of them in my contacts.
No, I've got a podcast, talk about, why everything sucks, but also what can we do about it? Try to not take the black pill on a daily basis, but it gets tempting every day that goes by. But yeah, that's me.
Cool, man. And then we got James Darien, the founder, owner, CEO, majority shareholder of Ember, and also the guy running Commutation Construct. So, James, what do you do?
Well, I think you covered most of what I do right there. But in addition to that, I have a camera that continuously freezes while working on Zoom, as we may have noticed from our first and now this recording already. But yeah, so I work. I have a bit of a philosophy channel, kind of based in traditional American values. I'm doing read-throughs of the Federalist Papers, among other general analyses.
Awesome, man. Well, hopefully you can get unfrozen.
Yeah, hopefully.
Flattering position.
Yeah, right. It's better than having your mouth open or doing something. Or I mean, your last pose is a power pose, but this one's pretty good. All right, so the topic for today is going to be diversity training, sensitivity training, social justice, or we can call it by its real name, critical race theory or anti-racism. So let me give me a brief explanation as to the origins of this type of racial equity school of thought, I guess you can call it. And yes, this may get a bit in the weeds, but you kind of got to sometimes get through the weeds in order to get the clearing at the end. So I think it's important to kind of go through some of these origins. So critical race theory, CRT, is a part of a more general category of critical theories, or what Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay refer to as just theory in general. These theories include critical studies on race, gender studies, intersectional feminism, fat studies, and all those other kinds of studies that sound really, really cool and interesting to get an easy A in college. But the origins go all the way back to the Frankfurt School that was formed between World War I and World War II. The Frankfurt School was an attempt by intellectuals, academics, social and political philosophers to criticize capitalism, fascism, and most of all, Marxism. But they didn't really reject Marxism wholesale, I guess. They became what we now call neo-Marxists. And the problem with Marxism is that it never could catch on in free societies, aka the West, because its focus on economics and destruction of the free market obviously went against all of our principles. And when people are actually in a free market, they notice, hey, this is the best way to find prosperity, so why would I go against it? But neo-Marxism broadened the scope to include social issues and eventually evolved into, what Pluckrose and Lindsay refer to as postmodernism. Or, well, I mean, a lot of people refer to it as postmodernism, but postmodernism broke everything down into more of a nihilistic struggle for power. And I say nihilistic because the central claim is that truth can never really be known because we can't step outside our own system and privilege to understand or examine the objective truth, right? So it rejects objective truth in a way. But postmodernism did get traction in academia. but had no real application to real living people in the real world. So the form of postmodernism died out in the 80s and 90s, mostly in academia. So when you kind of throw this postmodernism label at a lot of people, are like, oh, that died out, decades ago. But really, it does live on in a different form. And, that different form, it sprang out like a crow flying out of a dumpster fire, a new form of postmodernism that could apply to normal people, making them all activists is really the point. Pluckrose and Lindsay refers to this as applied postmodernism, which the intangible elements of postmodernism now became actionable through activist scholarship. To quote the cynical theories written by Pluckrose and Lindsay, the practical aim of this evolved form of postmodernism is to, quote, reconstruct society in an image of an ideology which came to refer to itself as social justice. Social justice, critical race theory, anti-racism all sprung from the origins in neo-Marxist thought, where every human interaction is just a struggle for power. It's all about oppressor versus oppressed narratives. And if you reject those narratives, that just means you are the oppressor. So I kind of hope that gives a decent overview of the origins of the topic today. I did leave out some, details like the role of critical legal studies and some of the influencers or thought leaders of this movement, like Kimberly Crenshaw, Ibram X. Kendi, and Robert DiAngelo. But I figure we'll probably get to those guys at some point in this conversation. So I kind of left it out at the beginning. So with that, let's start our first discussion topic. And really what I kind of written down as in the general outline is really, where did you first hear of CRT or anti-racism? Was it in school? Was it at work? Was it on social media? And what was it referred to as? A lot of it isn't just CRT or anti-racism. Now it's kind of labeled as anti-racism, but normally it's disguised as one of those, names I said before, as racial sensitivity training or something like that. But when you heard of it, did it raise red flags right away, or did you kind of go with it? And that's kind of my first discussion. So James, if you're there and unfrozen, take it away, man.
I am here and I am unfrozen for
Nice.
once. So I actually have an interesting background with critical race theory because I graduated from college in 2016 and I did also just get my MBA. So I kind of went through, I was in college right as it started to pick up within the college scene a lot. So with my college, it was more of a focus on, it seemed to be more of a focus on critical gender theory. But the thing is, I didn't even realize it had a term for what it was until probably until Dave Rubin interviewed Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay, and they covered the hoax they did with the critical studies. So for me, I always I recognized it, but I didn't really know what it was until I listened to that conversation. And I started to see the stuff as things like safe spaces start to show up at my school. Things like just having conversations with people about certain topics sort of start to become, I wouldn't say necessarily off limits, but it was very limited. It was very restrained. I would say restrained, not necessarily off limits. And there began to really be this pressure around like 2015-ish, around 2015, 2016 especially, where it's like, if you fall along a certain side of the argument, then you basically have to keep your mouth shut. When I started college, I saw people having discussions, and there were between people who would say they're conservative, people who would say they're liberal. By the time I graduated, nobody would mention which side of the political spectrum they were on. You basically just kind of had to go along with what people were saying.
And you went to, did you go to like a fairly, you can go to extremely liberal college. In terms of a liberal college, they almost all are, but were you in something known to be very liberal, or is it just kind of because I know in the area you probably went to probably wasn't as liberal, right?
It's decently liberal. I went to I transferred school, so I went to two schools. So I went to Tulane University first, which is fairly liberal because it's in New Orleans and it's full of kids from the Northeast. school in Florida that also had people from all over, and the school made a point of like 10% of their starting class. I'm frozen again. Okay. They made a point of about 10% of their starting class being international students, stuff like that. And when I first transferred there, it was like 6 or 7%. But by the time I graduated, they started thinking about how diverse their pool was and how they were giving scholars full rides to like half the students. I was not one of them, but like they started really talking up about their social programs and all this stuff as things went along. And it's funny because I knew people who were on the board of directors who were like, this school's going to go broke.
Nice. All right. Well, thanks for your story. Truman, what do you got?
Well, a couple things. First off, I was like fighting hard to not interrupt you there. I just because I think words matter. You probably know what I'm going to say, but I prefer leftist to liberal because we know that liberal's been hijacked, and what we just used to describe, or what you were just talking about when you used the word liberal, was the opposite.
I was thinking more like liberal arts.
Yeah, I know what you mean, but people hear that and they use liberal and leftist interchangeably, even though they're like polar opposites today.
Liberal arts school, but the students were self-defining as liberal. That's
fine. I understand that. People self-define as a lot of things that aren't accurate these days. So that I don't really have a bunch of concern with that. But yeah. Well, the other thing is, and maybe we hit on this, but I think it'd be worthwhile because the odds of 100% of the people who would watch this knowing why it matters, like why it matters to listen to what you said, and in terms of those, which was a really good quick run through definition and all the other stuff, because this is pretty esoteric. Like you said, you can get off in the weeds, necessarily so. But I wonder if it'd be first valuable to give a brief premise of why this conversation matters, like why people should care. There's a lot of things I think people don't realize that they should care. They think there are all these issues that they shouldn't care about, or they don't have to have an opinion. And kind of like what we talked about last time, I don't think people should have to have an opinion on a lot of stuff, but they are being required to have an opinion. Last night I was posting something on Bentham's, in response to something Bentham wrote, and the thought that came to my head is standing room only, no benches. There are people that might be thinking they're sitting on the bench, the people who think they're writing this out, or sitting this out, but that's not actually happening. So to those people who think that, I can just, this doesn't, I graduated college 20 years ago. Why I don't want to do homework now, Karlyn, I think that was something we kind of talked about a little bit in our conversation of like, this stuff can be pretty tedious. So I don't know, what would your thoughts be on that, of just to kind of throw a question back to you, Kevin, since you framed all this, if you were to add just like a quick elevator pitch of why people should give a crap.
Well, I mean, I have a personal investment, I guess, into this, just because, I guess to go through the reason that I got into it, really, I didn't see it. I'm one of the people that you're talking about who hasn't seen it, and I'm not going to give you an opinion on it because I didn't know it existed. I didn't acknowledge it existed. And then I started to, educate myself a little bit more. And someone that really opened my eyes up to it in general was someone like Thomas Sowell, someone who really pushed back against the narrative of, the Black oppression narrative, that it's no doubt that there's oppression in this country. There's no doubt that racism exists, but, to keep pushing oppression narratives is really damaging to the people that are supposed to be the oppressed. So, that just highlighted it to me. But then when it really, made me aware that, hey, this is something that's going to touch my life, is when it comes in an email from my children's school to say that it's going to be taught to them. So now it's become a topic that I need to understand and I need to research in order for it to form a full opinion about it, right? Yep. Because it doesn't matter if it was anything. If they taught something about some weird way of gardening, it's like, okay, I would read and I would try to figure out what it's about rather than just taking their word for it, because there's a reason why they're trying to say, hey, parents, just, we're going to teach them this. That means there's might be something controversial about it. So I think that's why it was important to me, and really anyone with kids or expects to have kids. it's going to be important to you because it's going to touch your life. And the reason why, I kind of went through it quickly, the evolution of Marxism, the neo-Marxism, the postmodernism. Well, postmodernism didn't appeal to anyone outside of academia, but they were still teaching it in academia. And now that they've kind of, to use a term that you've used in the past, Truman, kind of terraformed the culture at large to bring this in because they were taught about it in college. That is why this is more accepting now. So yep. Even though it's not something that I want to go out there and necessarily fight against, it is something that's directly impacted my life and is going to impact the life of, again, anyone who plans to have children. And that is why it's important to me.
Yeah. So to extrapolate out from that principle, you have to know this in a way that you don't have to know obscure gardening tactics, because it's not going to be forced into your workplace, your children's, education, college education, your social circles, your faith community or whatever. But this stuff, this racial stuff, is being forced into all of these aspects of life. So, and because it's dangerous and caustic in a lot of ways for relationships, people need to know it. It's because in other words, they can't avoid it. Like, just if you can avoid learning about it, but you can't avoid having to engage with it or the consequences and leverage it's going to have on your life in all these different aspects of your life. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the way I would say, there's like two things, right? There's, let's say, so I had a friend who had like this really, actually, I'll give a better example. Have you ever heard Scott Adams talk about his throat thing that he had? So he talks about it in Loser Think, but he had this thing where he like couldn't talk in certain situations and stuff. And he would just, it was a super weird thing. And he spent a long time noticing it and trying to figure out what exactly it was. And then finally, at some point, he found the name for it and was able to find a doctor who was like, yep, that's what it is, and come up with a treatment thing. So I could say there's the times like I can pinpoint when I first started noticing the symptoms, noticing kind of something's going on here, something's strange. And then when I figured out like what the name of it was, I guess. And that was whenever, like Karlyn, I always voted Democrat my entire life, one of the good guys, right? Default settings, blue all the way down. But whenever the Michael Brown stuff happened, so there was Trayvon Martin and then Michael Brown. And it was just, that year was characterized by just news stories of white cop shoots black suspect. And I've mentioned this before, but at the time I was pre-law. And so I was taking a lot of classes just about jurisprudence and, how our judicial system works and the Constitution and the legal system and so on and so forth. And I was just confused by, I was like, why is this, why, white guy shoots black guy. We don't know if it's racism. Maybe, like, I'm not saying it couldn't have been, but I didn't understand. And I saw all these people that I knew were like my team. So I used to have CNN on like 24/7 in my dorm room, NPR preset 1 in my car. And I would hear that. And then this is also when the Democrat primaries are starting to kind of be in full swing. So Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders and Martin O'Malley. And what was that guy named, the one guy's name, like Jim Webb or something, that was in there for like 5 seconds. But anyway, and I'm like hearing these folks that, again, it's my team and like Barack Obama echoing these things. And I'm like, what? That doesn't really make sense. And then once evidence comes out, I'm like, why do we keep jumping to this? So that's when I started to see like some of the racial stuff be like, it felt like it was being forced on us in a way that just didn't line up with just logic to me. And where I started to see that my team and those who I thought I identified with and aligned with were clearly going down a path that I couldn't, they weren't leaving me sufficient evidence or anything to follow them on that path. I was more than open to it. And then also about a year or so after that, I started seeing some of like weird emphasis on race and increased diversity, which is basically they're like black people. Because I would say, well, how many are you trying to get equal representation of Samoans? What about Cherokee Indians? Like, but it was like, yeah, okay, no black people. And so I'm like, okay, I mean, that's fine, but it's weird to like that to be your push, and specifically in this ministry that I was a part of. And so I was starting to see some red flags there, but I think, like James said, I didn't really put anything like in terms of like what this is with critical theory until the grievance studies hoax. I mean, I had read Thomas Sowell books, and I had like listened to people debate these ideas, but to me, it was just like those who see racism everywhere and those who don't. I had this kind of idea evolution of where I've went through in different points in time. And, last year I was really heavy in postmodernism, learning about it, studying it. And then from there it was kind of a natural jumping off point into the early critical theorists, Laclau and Mouffe or whatever. And so, so that's kind of what it was for me, I guess. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's been a process of seeing race being the thing I thought that we all agreed was like not that important, like shouldn't be that important. You shouldn't, judge people by the color of their skin, to like being the most important thing. And then it really wasn't until maybe the last year and a half or so that I found out what the name for it was.
Yeah, it's funny you say calling out by name. I don't know if you guys watch these kind of like ghost demon possession type movies, like The Conjuring and stuff like that. Yeah, I love those kind of movies. But There's like a common theme you find in a lot of them, that if someone's possessed by a demon, like the first step is knowing its name. And then when you say its name, it'll start freaking out, right? It's the first step is learning what the name is. And that's like, I think that's a good archetype for saying you got the first step in anything is calling out what this is for what it is. You have to say, okay, this is what this is. Don't pretend it's something else. Don't pretend it's sensitivity training. Call it out as critical race theory. And like a lot of people, like, James Lindsay will say, they rarely ever call it CRT. It's always anti-racism or, sensitivity this or racial equality that. It's or racial equity that. And it's, the first step is always just calling it out by name. And once you can start to do that, then we can actually start talking with the same terms. And so I think that's a really good, important thing you brought up there. But let's go to Karlyn. I know you have just a generally interesting story about how you were red pilled and all that stuff. But, did this kind of race stuff kind of play a role in that?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely did. And when I first started learning about critical race theory, I mean, it really came from like 3 different places, and it all kind of started happening around the same time. The first place it came from, well, the thing I've been most vocal about publicly is it happening in the knitting community, where these roving mobs of like social justice warriors were going around and attacking people who didn't use the words they wanted them to use, who wouldn't bend the knee to what they wanted them to say. They even went around attacking people who just weren't saying anything. So if you were remaining silent, your silence was violence, and then you would get mobbed. And that was one of the more overt place that I saw. But really, that was just one of like several places that had started popping up in my life around the same time. And this was, I want to say this was like, it started like 2018, 2019, like early 2019, something like that. Where the other places were just in my work as an organizational psychologist, I had clients that all of a sudden microaggressions were becoming a thing, and I'd never heard of microaggressions before. I was like, what the hell is this? And when you research microaggressions, you find out that it all goes back to one academic at Columbia University who decided that this was a real thing, has never actually provided evidence to back up that this is a real thing, but has made a boat ton of money training people on how not to have microaggressions or what to do when microaggressions pop up. Microaggressions are essentially anything from any sort of minor infraction, like how it would manifest in the workplace is if you're Black and I forget to CC you on an email one day, well, that would be a microaggression, which means I'm obviously racist because I forgot to CC you on an email, or I forgot to invite you to a meeting, or things that happen all the time in organizations that frankly are usually nothing more than an oversight or a miscommunication or any of these things. We're suddenly being elevated to HR as this racist insult, when in fact it was just someone making a mistake that every single person who's ever worked in an organization has probably made at some point or another. So that was another place that I saw it. But the most alarming one for me was actually one I haven't talked about publicly as much, which is my friends. Because I worked in higher education for like 10 years. And so a lot of my friends were in higher education in various different parts of the industry. And it was like, people I had known for years and years and years and never had any problems with, was like, you know, who were sometimes the first people I would call when something was happening in my life. All of a sudden they started saying, Karlyn, you need to shut up and listen to Black people. And I was like, what? Like, where did this come from? And they would be like really aggressive about it, and they would they were using this language that I didn't understand, and they were starting to call each other out, and they would call me out a lot because I didn't understand what was going on, and so I wasn't playing into this. I was like, you guys are being weird. Like, what in the heck are you even talking about? And I truly, for the longest time, had no idea what was going on, other than my friends were acting like they had been taken over by like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And so all of these things it was like a perfect storm of all these elements. And I started looking around for answers, and eventually went on to the YouTubes and found people talking about it and was able to put a name to it. And I agree with Truman's point that, you know, it is important for everyone to understand this stuff. I might differ slightly in that I don't necessarily think it's important for every single person to understand the background and the history and all the nuance, because there's a lot. There is a lot to this. It is a monster of a topic to take on. But I think that very minimally, people need to understand that this does come from somewhere. It is a real thing. It is not made up. It is not hyperbolic. When people are speaking about the danger of what this ideology is, it is a very real danger. And so, you know, knowing what it is on a high level and how to identify it and what the words they're using actually mean. Like, for example, these people have completely changed the definition of racism. They've completely changed it to mean, like, whereas racism used to mean that a person thought that one race was superior to another race, it doesn't mean that anymore in the land of critical race theory. It means that everyone who is white is racist. And it's important to understand how these definitions have changed and how people are using them, because it's going to show up in your life at some point. And if you aren't prepared to know what's going on, trust me when I tell you, it's going to be the oddest experience of your life when all of a sudden everyone you know is using language that you don't understand and you haven't caught up to it yet. So I do think it's important that people know it from that respect, because it will happen to everyone.
Yeah, and
like oil change knowledge is what I call it. Like, you don't need to know how to rebuild and take apart, you know, your own car and repair everything. But you have to have like I know how to change my own oil understanding of this thing, like to be able to engage with it on the most basic level. I don't know how to change my own oil. No, that's fine, but you see what I'm saying? Like, you have to have some working knowledge of it to, like, there's obviously layers, but you have to have a base level knowledge so that when they're using those words, you're like, wait a second, that's not what that means, or no, you know what I mean? Like, you have to know what to listen for. That's what I mean. I'm not saying people need to read every part of the literature. Absolutely not. God, that would be awful.
Yeah, but I mean, that's important. What Karlyn brings up with the redefinitions, because like I have the definition right here from Ibram X. Kendi, is how he defines racist, which is one who's supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea. He uses the word racist twice in the definition of racist. Like, that's just on purpose creating circular logic. He just allowed himself enough wiggle room to just say literally anything can be racist, because, you know, as my English teacher in second grade told me, never define a word by using the same word in its definition, because it doesn't make any sense.
Racism means doing racism, guys. No, you don't get it.
Exactly.
Ibram X. Kendi makes a boat ton of money using that definition. He has every reason in the world to be able to define absolutely everything as racist. He's a millionaire because of it.
And that seems to go across all these critical theories. It's definitely not just a critical race theory. It seems to go into gender and sexuality and all that other type of stuff too. Like you, Karlyn, I saw a lot of this actually stemming from friend groups, probably mostly around the time a bit after Trump got in. It really escalated a lot. So I noticed a lot of it at college, but then when I was going through my graduate program, I actually ended up deleting my Facebook because this stuff became so prevalent that that just making like small jokes to my friends, and like like my best friend is half black, and he and I like to make jokes at each other's expense all the time. And like we were just making some jokes online, and then suddenly like 5 random fraternity brothers were calling me racist for something that he and I do as having fun. So it's just like, excuse me?
James Darien has a bunch of N-word Facebook posts out there, is what I just heard.
No, but
cancel.
Continue with your story. Don't explain.
But yeah. But yeah, so I saw a bit of this on the race side. I saw a lot of it on the, at least with my generation, a lot of it's more on the gender and sexuality side of the critical theory. I guess it kind of depends where you are, where you're living, but in the area I'm in, the gender theory is almost everything. Like, I didn't even really think of it, and then one day, one of my friends came up and was just telling me that it's bigoted to not be willing to, pardon my French, try out lady dick.
What?
Was this friend a male or a female?
Yeah, he
Appropriate way to stage that question,
it's a male?
Truman.
Yeah, I was going to say, your friend is setting up the conversation for justifying the fact that he tried some lady dick at some point in time, so that if you ask him,
well,
he's going to say you're a bigot for not. Oh, yeah, there you go. That's what it is.
Yeah, no. He is very proud of the fact that he has.
Hey, man, whatever.
Yeah. So when I say deviating from the original outline, this is probably where we shouldn't go.
The point was just how much it escalated in recent years, because I remember in 2016 with the same friend, I had a conversation about just how he didn't like Donald Trump, but how it basically just came down to, he's an asshole, I don't like it. But you are right, he's been pretty good for some stuff, to the point where if I mentioned his name, like he would literally go red in the face, start like yelling about all these right-wing actors and stuff, like Ben Shapiro or et cetera, et cetera. But
can I steel man a little bit of the lady dick thing? Okay, so hear me out here. No, listen. So that's fine, but there is an important aspect to this, because
just use protection, please.
One thing that's part of all of this is that what we can say is observably true about critical theory, wherever it is it's never satisfied with your levels of acceptance or acquiescence to it. It's always going to demand more of you, and it always takes things to an incredibly unreasonable place. And that's kind of part of all of our stories here, right? Is that there are these things where it's like, yeah, no, we all agree on this, and then we start to see a contingent, whether it's a friend group, whether it's our kids' schools, knitting circles, whatever, of them start to go past the point of the thing where it's like, we all agree on this. And now they're into the realm of, it's like, what, this is very niche. We're into something that seems probably hazardous to just rush into turning all these things into axioms, I guess is my point. And so James' story about that, his friend who is, maybe his friend's always been, more on the wild side, but like that friend might not recognize the version of himself that he was even a few years ago, or a few years before he had that statement or experience. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. But there's a lot of people that, we were all in this realm of, we all agree on these things, that racism is bad. We all agree on these things, that people should have equal rights, but then they change the definitions of what it means to be a bigot, what it means to be a racist, what it means to have equal rights, or that not having equality is actually bad. So we need to have equity instead. And so I actually think James' story with his friend highlights perfectly how off the rails this thing takes everything that is a good thing, like acceptance and, tolerance in the traditional sense, not the paradox of tolerance stuff, but like just treating people with basic human dignity. It takes those things and it hijacks it so that pretty soon you're having crazy conversations like that with your friend where it's like, what are you even doing? But it does this incrementally with people as they go down that road of agreeing to things without realizing what they're agreeing to. And so I think that's a really good example of the ways in which this can just twist people's mind and twist their understanding of reality. And and something that I want to talk about later is just the way that it poisons relationships. It's just deadly. It's deadly poisonous to relationships.
Well, one thing it seems to do is that it fetishizes tolerance. It basically, there was such a growing feeling of like people wanting to be tolerant, wanting to be open and understanding to each other, to the point where there was almost a lack of an enemy, and it needed to keep escalating to one up itself in order to like continue to find something to put you on like this moral high ground almost, or even to justify someone's own inner thoughts or feelings.
Robin DiAngelo,
like,
for example.
Every part. Yeah, exactly. Like her own feelings of how she's a racist, essentially, and how she feels bad about it. A parent feels bad / profiteers off of it. It's really just fetishizing the tolerance that everything that about her must be accepted. And because tolerance has been fetishized to the way where everything about everyone must be accepted, it's really it's leaving out the room for any kind of normal discussion, and it ends up ironically making people incredibly intolerant to anyone who's just like, who even would say that no, there are intolerant things about people. There are things that I don't need to be okay with, but that doesn't really. And you can even say, but that doesn't matter to me. But they're going to say just because you aren't willing to accept it with open arms. That's a big problem. I'm not even sure. You know what? I said it was a fetishization of tolerance. It may actually just be the fetishization of acceptance.
Victimhood.
More than tolerance, even.
Of victimhood. It's a fetish. It's fetishizing victimhood. And you have to accept the narrative of that victim. So, I mean, they go hand in hand. I don't think it's either or. But so, Kevin, in all fairness, maybe a little off the rails, but I think that that is relevant to some degree in terms of what this ideology does. It
certainly ties in together all of the theory, right? There are different subsets of theory. They all kind of act the same way. The only reason that, depending on where you're at, James has a point there, depending on where you're at, physically, those same tools will work together to maximize gender justice or social justice or racial justice. It all depends on what's at large at the time, and that's why the race narrative is a little bit larger because I think they feel like they have a bit better backing on it. I mean, when you have this infrastructure that can then implement and push all of this revisionist history to kind of bolster their credibility, it really, really helps them. And they see a past in America that, did have slaves, did have some really dark days in their past, and they use it and change it to mold whatever narrative they want. So they use a bit of revisionist history like the 1619 Project to push the narrative up today.
Well, I want to bounce off that because I think that they will use whatever tool they need to that is the most opportunist at the time. The reason that so much of this is focused on race right now is because it is the most opportunist tool to use. A couple years ago during the Kavanaugh hearings, gender was the most opportunist tool to use. So it does not matter. These people do not have principles that they stick to no matter what. And I'll give you an example of this. So if we look at just the race elements, they have a little hierarchy in terms of who is the most oppressed in terms of all of these elements. If we want to look at the top, we've got like Black trans women at the top as the most oppressed, right? So the Black, and the darker your skin is, the more oppressed you are, is right up at the top. And then maybe they have Native Americans right under it, I think, right now. And then maybe they have like Latinos, and then they have Asian, and then they have white. Asians are usually at the very bottom of the racial oppression hierarchy, except when COVID first started. And Trump was making it a point to call it the China virus. And then all of a sudden, these people who did not care hell or high water about Asians before that, who were perfectly fine with schools like Harvard and Yale actively discriminating against Asians based on their race, making it harder for Asians to get into their schools. Like, this was something that was, they were actually statistically oppressed by these institutions. Applicants that happened to be Asian, it was much harder for them to get into college. That was completely okay. But the minute that COVID hit and Trump was talking about China virus, Asians all of a sudden vaulted to the very highest point of the racial oppression hierarchy. And that was all that we were talking about until George Floyd. And then as soon as George Floyd happened, the Asians went back down to the bottom and black went back up to the top. And if we look at what's happening now with some of the things coming out of the Biden administration, they are very literally characterizing Asians as white. By their own definitions now, Asians have ascended to whiteness. And Robin DiAngelo actually talks about this in White Fragility. She was actually asked by someone that she was doing a training for who happened to be Italian. She was asked, like, by this guy, you know, what about Italians? Italians were discriminated against all the time. And what Robin DiAngelo replied is that Italians had ascended to whiteness. Irish had ascended to whiteness. And now Asians have ascended to whiteness because they are no longer useful.
Yep. They did the same thing with Sarah Jeong, the New York Times. Remember, it was all of a sudden. So Sarah Jeong had all those racist tweets about white men, you know, white people, you know, belong in caves and all this other stuff. Like I love making old white men cry, like all the super racist stuff. And then the people that, whenever she got hired by the New York Times, people were like, hey, she has a bunch of racist tweets that are fairly recent. You know, this isn't good. And then it was, well, she's a woman of color and she was responding to people who were racist against. So then she was a woman of color. It's my point. But when it's in other areas, then they're white. So there is no logical consistency, and that's by design. But that's a really good point, Karlyn, that it's really just about whatever is convenient to get you power and to wield as a club against people in the moment.
Absolutely, man. Kind of the next topic I wanted to discuss is, I think it's fair to say this thing seems like it's gaining traction. At least it feels that way. But it's kind of hard to figure out, is it because it's gaining support? Because I don't think we can even claim that a majority of people believe in this. But there is a growing minority of people that believe in this. Or are there just a growing minority of people that are so afraid to speak out against it, they're willing to just go with it, and hopefully it turns around, someone else turns it around before, you know, it acts upon them. So kind of, I guess my question is, like, you know, is this movement driven by, you know, actual appeal to people, or is it just completely driven by fear?
I think it's not a growing minority of people who are afraid of it. I think it's the majority of people who are afraid, who do not understand what's going on and are afraid of standing up against it. Or maybe I was having this conversation with Jody Shaw, who's at Smith College, who's being very brave and speaking out, and has experienced a lot of personal consequences for speaking out against what's going on at Smith College. And what she keeps telling me is that people come up to her all the time and they say, you know, I don't like this stuff. This does not pass the smell test for me, but people are scared of speaking out because they think they're going to lose their jobs. I think the biggest majority of people are in that category. I think it is a very vocal minority who actually buys into this idea. Nice.
Anyone else got anything on that?
I mean, what Karlyn's saying is really true. Because even within those groups like that I talked about, even among my age group, it tended to only be like, from like an entire fraternity class of like 30 people, it was maybe 5 people. But the thing is, they're so loud and they get so on everybody's case, and they rally people to their side, that it ends up. It ends up being like soldiers. Only the generals are really a part of the party, but the foot soldiers are the people who they surround themselves with, who will just go along with what they say. And that ends up becoming a much stronger force. And that's the real problem of it, is that so many people end up being either scared into becoming foot soldiers, or they just end up acting that way. Because that's their friend, or that's someone that they trust or believe in, whatever the case may be. So I lost my train of thought.
I mean, I think that kind of goes along with some of this is the ability to disarm so easily a lot of the people who are fighting against it, which I think some of it is a bit valid.
Yeah.
So like an example of this is, something that they use, they call everything racist. If they don't like the flavor of the day on their ice cream, the ice cream is racist. Like it's just how it works for them. And because it's kind of the culture at large and people are afraid to speak out against it, no one pushes back. But when the pushback comes from us, and that's, kind of the flip side of understanding the origins of all this stuff, when you first say this has its origins in Marxism or neo-Marxism, they automatically be like, okay, you're just one of those people who says everything's Marxist. And that is because it's been overused and abused by conservatives in the past. The same goes for communism, same goes for socialism. That's why I try not to even use those terms anymore, because as soon as people hear it, boom, they just shut off and it's completely disarmed. So I think there's the inability that some people feel to fight back, even if they know kind of the tools that they can use to fight back against it. It just makes it harder and just kind of makes that, again, I do think I agree with Karlyn, as a majority of people who are more scared of it than that. I still think slightly growing minority of people who truly believe in it.
Totally. And I just looked up a quick stat because I think there is, I've been talking lately about just this asymmetrical relationship we have with time in terms of the power shifting more and more towards this thing. So Michael Brown died in fall of 2014. So imagine you were 13 years old when that happened. And over the last 7 years, every successive generation that has graduated from high school, so this year's graduating class in the US is expected to be about 3.7 million. And so I reduced it to 3.5 to try and figure out some average over the last 7 years. And it was just under 25 million high school graduates, since 2014. Or almost, when they'll graduate in May or whatever. So that's about 25 million kids that grew up at a time whenever everything was a racist race, cops are bad, white people are racist. It's more and more in their schools, more and more in their friends network, more and more in the colleges they're going to. And every year that goes by, we're going to have more of that. Like the percentage of those graduates that are more into this than not is high, right? Like there's way more that are bought into this than aren't. And the problem is that those that aren't like opposed to it. They're just quiet and they're cowed into silence. And so what you have is you have a plurality of kids that graduate every year that are more and more online. So that's where you're getting more of that Twitter presence, Facebook, and that's what the corporations. So it becomes like it's a positive feedback loop. So they get this information about how racist everything is, and then they regurgitate it back into the system, and the system sees that as confirmation. And then it just keeps going and going and going. It's just cyclical. And so every year we have a plurality of graduates that are more and more into this. We also have converts that are being made that are incrementally moved from, center left to far left, after these things happen. So we have a serious convert crisis here in terms of, this thing makes a lot of converts and it silences those it doesn't convert, because they have, and they should be afraid, by the way. They could lose their job. All these things could happen. Like the fear is justified. The problem is like I said earlier, the idea that if you don't do anything, that it won't come for you. I think that's the naivete, and that's kind of one of the things we're trying to address here is people to understand the gravity of it. But I think that's part of there's a practical mathematic situation here that we're dealing with, every successive year that I think can't be ignored. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think a big reason for that is that when, and the reason people have trouble fighting against this is because people, when you talk to anyone who really buys into this, the people, like you said, you have to convert them because it really becomes core to their identity. And in most relationship groups, people don't want to offend the core of someone's identity. Just that is the good faith that societies, friend groups, and just people interacting tend to operate on. And I think that actually gives us a lot more strength than it otherwise would have. Because if it was just a bad idea, you could just be like, nah, man, you're being an idiot. Like it could be beer talk. But when it becomes so core to someone's identity, it's literally like fighting a war.
Well, and that goes, I mean, that goes to like people could talk about lack of meaning or loss of strength of religious institutions in society, and all those are relevant. But the deeper part, I think, people don't want to offend the core identity of someone in their friend groups because they want to maintain the relationship. And so a lot of times maintaining the relationship becomes the prime value as opposed to, lovingly correcting your friend, rebuking them or trying to speak truth to them. People would rather, not sacrifice the relationship than have those hard conversations. And that's how, whenever Karlyn and I had that conversation, talking about the similarities between this and abusive emotional abuse, is it really is like that, because people, I don't want to lose this relationship. I don't want to lose it. I see what happens whenever I step out of bounds, and I don't want, all these things to happen that very well could happen. And so it's just easier to be bullied into silence and be gaslit than it is to speak out. And that's why one of the things, I can't remember, it was in a conversation sometime recently where one of the things I was saying is, that people have to be okay with the fact that their social landscape is going to change. Like, people have this notion that their social landscape isn't going to change. It is going to change, whether you like it or not. It might not change if you go along with it or go along with all this stuff, but then you'll probably lose some of the people who don't. I hate that it feels like Civil War, brother against brother stuff, but I mean, it is what it is. But once people get over the fact that their social landscape is going to change, I think it becomes easier to stand up to people and say, okay, truth is more valuable than maintaining the relationship here, or more, truth is more valuable than hurting their feelings, at least. That doesn't mean you don't bring it up in a way that's, kind, but truth has to be the prime value there.
Well, you say don't bring it up in a way that's not kind. In an environment where everything can be spun as offensive, it makes it all that much harder.
Sure.
And it doesn't mean don't speak truth. And then there's people on the left and the right kind of both saying the same thing. Like, you have to speak truth. Like, truth should be the most important thing to you. But again, another aspect that came out of postmodernism is objective truth cannot be obtained because you're stuck within your own system and your own privilege.
Well, I mean, and I don't know. I kind of take the perspective, and I know this is a controversial thing to say, but I actually don't believe there is such a thing as an objective reality. I don't. I think that you can always look at something multiple different ways from multiple different angles, and usually you aren't going to find the one angle that is the absolute right in all circumstances. And I think that's a very valid argument to make. But what the thing about these people is they distort everything. Everything is distorted. And I want to speak to specifically the idea of, like, you're going to lose social relationships, you're going to lose friends. When those friends are so willing to call you a racist over not using a word that they want you to use, then are they really your friends to begin with? And I think what people need to wrap their heads around is that this entire ideology completely screws the way that people see the world. They're not able, like, I can say there's no such thing as an objective reality, and then I can say, I can look at it from your perspective, I can look at it from your perspective, I can look at it from your perspective, I can articulate different points of view, even if I don't necessarily agree with them. At least I can articulate them and have a conversation about why someone might perceive it in that way. People who are sucked into the postmodernism or the critical race theory ideology, they are unable to do that. They are unable to see things from my perspective, see things from Kevin's perspective, from James's perspective, from Truman's perspective. They're simply unwilling to entertain this as a viable idea. So I don't even buy into this notion that, the problem is that these people do not believe in objective truth. That's not it at all. The problem is that these people live in a land of confirmation bias where all they are looking for is for people is for ideas to conform to the way that they see the world. So I think that, there are perfectly valid reasons to say, we might look at reality from different perspectives. That's not what they're doing. This is a fundamentally authoritarian ideology that says if you don't bend the knee to what I want, then you don't belong in my life. People like that do not deserve your friendship. If they cannot rein it in to be able to have a conversation with you about your perspective and why you think it's wrong to label everything as racist, why you think it's wrong to call everyone a Nazi, and how that fundamentally dilutes the effectiveness of those terms and even the meanings of those terms, then are they really your friends to begin with? Well, no.
Yeah, well, it's a lack of empathy.
Yeah.
It's an asymmetrical application of empathy. It's infinite empathy for those they agree with, and it's no empathy for those they disagree with.
I don't know.
I even disagree with. I don't think they have empathy for those they agree with. I don't even think they have empathy there. I don't think that they are capable of giving empathy to even the people that they agree with. It's kind of like, yes, you're on the team. Good. I'm not going to attack you. Are they really empathetic to those people?
I'm using the word empathy as I'm willing to listen and hear you out kind of thing is what I mean. So obviously we could talk about the sincerity behind their actions. Sure. I'm just saying in terms of, one of the ways in which we express empathy is listening to people and wanting to hear them out and wanting to understand them. And in terms of at least that practice of listening to people and trying to put yourself in their shoes, they don't do that to those they disagree with. And they at least pay lip service to those that they do agree with. Again, I agree that there's the sincerity, at least on a lot of the parts, is probably not as authentic as it seems to be. But I mean, that's where, a bit pedantic. But the point is they asymmetrically apply something positive, goodwill, charitable interpretations, whatever, to some people and 0% to others. That's the point I'm making.
I don't know if I would consider that empathy or narcissism, because it's more like it's a hero complex in a way, and it's them sort of echoing, highlighting, and self-gratifying through other people who are justifying or reinforcing the hero narrative that they create inside their own head, or that they create for themselves.
I have to push back on the term narcissism. I think narcissism is a really overused term that most of the time does not mean what the people using it think it does. Narcissists do not need people to agree with them. They don't. They don't need people to agree with them. Narcissists have the ability, and this is a personality disorder. It's a sad thing. I never use the word narcissist as a pejorative or as like an insult. It is a sad thing to be a narcissist. It is a personality disorder that starts when you're a child, in which you learn how to completely reshape reality over what places you at the center of the universe. They literally do not need people to agree with them, because they can reshape reality in their head so it's just as real as what you and I are experiencing, where they are always right. They're the center of the universe. They don't have to let anything else in. So that's a minor point, but I just want to push back on the use of that term.
What term would you recommend?
I think there's a big difference too. Well, let me try to explain it this way. How I would really oppose this is, a lot of people would consider, the complete Trumpsters, the people who will believe yes to everything Trump says yes to, no to everything he says no to. You can kind of say that is a Trump cult, right? Because he's the leader of the cult. The leader is always right. Or when he says something else is wrong, the leader is always wrong. I think some people can categorize some people on Team Trump like that. But on this side of it, this functions much more like a corrupt religion. They'll throw their leaders under the bus. It doesn't actually matter at all. But it's the religious aspect, especially you think about white fragility. It's the unfalsifiable claims that are at the center of this thing that gives them an out no matter what talking point you throw their way or what statistic you throw their way. So I think they are almost worshiping this ideology like it's a religion. And I think that's why, it's easy for them to show empathy, or at least appear to show empathy toward people who are on their team at that time. But once that person screws up, I mean, they get thrown out of the religion and, they're gone. And again, it's a corrupt religion. So it'll attack other religions as infidels. If you're not living your life according to this strict, rigid ideology, you are the infidel now. And now, that's why it's so easy to be not compassionate toward anyone else who has a differing opinion.
Yep.
I mean, I think
Does that make more sense? I
agree with everything you just said there. I think I'd push back on the idea of like the Trump cult. And I think this is a really important difference to make. People who agree with Trump on every single thing, they're doing that of their own volition. no one is forcing them to do it. They're not necessarily going to get kicked out of the club if they say, "Ooh, I don't agree with Trump on this point." That's a choice that they're making. Is it, I don't know with that choice, but it's something they're engaging in voluntarily, and they're not being kept there out of fear of coercion, because if they disagree with Trump on something, well, welcome to the club. A lot of us like Trump, but disagree with him on many, many, many things. So there's no loss there if they do. Whereas if we look at, I very much agree with the analogy of this being a religion to these people. And it's not even just a religion, it's a religion in which there is no redemption. If you step outside the bounds of what is allowed, you are going to be forced to apologize, and then you're still going to get kicked out of the club anyway. So there is no way to be a member of this club in which you disagree with any of the tenets of the religion. And if you try it, you're going to be excommunicated.
Yeah, I
think there's a version that you can come back from it, and it is to be an ally and always continuously admit you're a vile racist,
right?
But
that's
become
not
an ally.
That's not redemption, though. That's the point. Is that, like, I speaking from like just a Judeo-Christian background, so in Judaism there was a sacrificial lamb every year that the priest would put the sins of the people on, and there'd be blood on it and send it off, and it was a way to atone for sin, to say these sins have been dealt with. And then in Christianity, it's the same way with Jesus, right? It's if you accept Jesus, accept his sacrifice, then your sins have been atoned for. They've been dealt with. You've been forgiven. And but with this, like what you just said, Kevin, that's not atonement. That's not redemption. That's slavery. It's, you have this burden of sin that you cannot get rid of. You can only get rid of the practical punishments for that sin in some ways, but you can't get rid of it. You are tethered to that sin. You are tethered to your whiteness. You are tethered to your privilege. And all you can do is mitigate how much punishment you get for it. But it'll never be zero, and you will never be forgiven. And you'll always have that mark, that stain of that sin of privilege on you, because it is part. You were talking about identity. It's part of your identity. So I'm a white male. I'm never going to get rid of this sin of being a white male, right? Like there is no actual true redemption from it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And the reason I brought up the Trump cult thing is more to juxtapose what a cult is compared to what a religion is. Some people are calling this a cult of wokeism. It's not a cult. It's not functioning like that because, again, I think the central function of a cult is to pick out a leader and to follow that leader no matter what. Whereas a religion, it's the rigid ideology, and you will throw a leader under the bus. Like there's sometimes Kendi gets thrown under the bus for some things he says. Like he came out and said something that it went against the gender narrative. I don't know if it went as far as lady dick, but it was apparently up there that he got a lot of pushback. So it will eat its leaders eventually. And that's what these people don't understand is even the people, the tippity top, the Robin DiAngelos will be eaten alive eventually. She's just like slowly tying the rope as they're ready to string it up. So I think that's
like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I don't know, like, I don't know. I maybe we've completely deviated from the outline at this point. Whatever.
No, we're right in it.
Excellent. So
I actually put Invasion of the Body Snatchers in the outline. You didn't see that?
I glitched. but what is confusing to me about this is why it sucks people in the way that it does, because it really is. It's like, I think about my now former friends who were normal people. One day they were completely normal people, and then the next day they wake up and they're talking about checking your privilege and shut up and listen to black people, and Karlyn, you're tokenizing black people. If you happen to find one black person that agrees with you, they're just a token and you're using it. And it was just like it was like so sudden and so quick. And I agree with you that it's not a cult because there is no one leader, but it's like the ideology is the leader. And it's almost like they're inflicting this on themselves. And I don't understand what is so compelling about this ideology. I mean, maybe it's that these kids, and when I say kids, I mean the ones in college right now because I'm old. Like they've been brought up in a society where like they've been catered to. Everyone's gotten a trophy. Their parents always fight their battles for them. All this stuff. But do they ever learn? I think the question is like, do they just not learn how to love themselves, and at some point it becomes easier to beat themselves up as racist forever and a day than it does to kind of like be in a world where they can be imperfect people and that's all right? Is it something about holding themselves to a higher example of perfection and virtue? I guess I'm not being very articulate, but I don't understand what is so compelling about this ideology that all of a sudden like swoops in and takes over people's entire sense of reality and sense of being.
Well, I think to personify this ideology a little bit more, it's a mind virus, is what it does. It acts just like it. It will slowly seed into your mind through normally tolerance or acceptance. It's normally the host, I guess, in this example, just wants to be open and wants to say, okay, I tolerate these new ideas because I don't understand them fully. I mean, if I'm a parent who has never heard of this before, or I've never been interested in this type of material, you know, if the school comes at me with anti-racist training, I'm like, yeah, I don't want my kid to be racist. So now they've already planted the seed of the mind virus in my brain. It's going to start growing. And when you start to see everyone who goes against this, you know, what Truman would call far left orthodoxy, get thrown under the bus, canceled, and called vicious, vile names, you're much less likely to, you know, find the antidote to this mind virus, and it slowly eats the host. And then, you know, going back to what we go to, and I think, you know, if you think about it that way, is how it evolves in the mind, it's easier to kind of, I guess, tangibly see what this ideology looks like.
Karlyn, could you say the definition of narcissism again?
Well, narcissism, there's this very specific personality disorder called narcissistic personality disorder. I don't have the proper definition right in front of me, but how it manifests is that people who have narcissistic personality disorder are very literally able to create a scenario in their heads in which they are the center of their universe. They do nothing wrong. They are the best. They are the best. I mean, Donald Trump, to be quite frank, I think does have narcissistic personality disorder. I absolutely do. He is the best at everything. He always wears the best clothes. He's very interested in image and all of this stuff. And if the things that get narcissists in trouble are when people try to disrupt their image of themselves. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm just kind of thinking of how the definition of narcissism, at least from the colloquial use of it, is how it differs from that, and how there may almost be like an opposite effect going on with a lot of people, where rather than saying, I don't
necessarily. Go ahead.
I was just say I think there's it seems like this may be spreading because of almost an opposite effect of it, where people are able to achieve and be given so much throughout their lives that they almost feel like they don't deserve what they're getting, or like they're not. That's why Hollywood.
I think that's why celebrities buy into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with. I do agree with you. People have not developed, because you know where self-worth comes from. It comes from challenging yourselves and seeing that you're up to the task. It comes from, well, I mean, in an ideal world, self-worth would come from someone saying, you know, I am worthy of love simply for being here. That's in an ideal world, but usually doesn't work out that way, because we're human beings and we live real lives, and we, you know, that just doesn't work out that way. Most people aren't taught how to do that. But you know, this is something I think that Jordan Peterson gets at, is in focusing on achieving things, focusing on something that is like a fulfilling goal, or even just making your bed in the morning, cleaning your room. Like worth can come from tasks like that, where you're doing something that's productive with your life. Generally speaking, I think there are two types of people in the world. I think there are creators and destroyers. Creators are doing something that serves the world, that serves humanity. They're building something, they're doing something, even if it's just something for themselves, quite frankly, like cleaning your room, or it's building a business, or writing a book, or, you know, doing a podcast, or whatever it happens to be. You're creating something in which there was nothing before. And then you have destroyers who don't feel like they have the self-confidence to give something to the world. They don't have the self-worth to say, I have something valuable that I can give and share with other people. And because they don't have that self-worth, what they focus on instead is trying to destroy the good work of other people, rip other people down. This is fundamentally where cancel culture comes from, right? It's like, I don't think I can do something, but I can make sure you don't have a job, or I can make sure your Twitter account gets banned, or what have you. And so I do think that there's something to what you just said, James, in terms of like, it might be like a reverse narcissism thing, because like, especially with kids who are going through school now, or maybe have recently graduated, they grew up in a world where they did not have to develop resiliency. They didn't have to do any of this stuff. Their parents did it for them. And so they've come into the world completely ill-equipped out of years and years and years of schooling, in which they've been taught not how to do any of this stuff. They've been taught how to recite whatever the teacher or mother or father tell them.
Yeah, I mean, so I honestly, I think, you know, I'm still kind of marinating in your thinking out loud from a second ago, Karlyn, where you said, you're like, I don't understand the appeal of this ideology to people. And I think it's a lot of things. I think it depends on the person. Like, if you're a religious Christian, like it could be someone says, well, actually, if you really care about this one Bible verse, this is what it really means. You know, don't you like compassion, or don't you like this thing? And it can come from good intentions. I think for other people, it comes from fear. I think for other people, it comes from a desire for acceptance. I think what you just said about the college students and, you know, and the last, let's say, decade or so of generations, very much, I'm going back through Eric Hoffer as a true believer. And one of the things he talks about is, you know, the people who get caught up in mass movements typically are people who want to be free from freedom. They don't want the weight of responsibility for their own actions. And so they want to get lost in something where they don't have to be held responsible. They want to give up their freedom because they find freedom to be stifling. And so those kids who never had to do anything for themselves, now whenever they're held account for their actions, it's like, wait a second, it's a crippling thing. And I think there's another aspect, you know, I don't know if I've ever articulated this in a recorded conversation before, but and I'm also, the irony is not beyond me that we're three white guys and a white girl talking about race stuff, you know, but I desperately desire a world where we can do that and it doesn't matter, like that's where we are. But I think there's something like, if you look at, I had this thought maybe a couple months ago, and I was listening to someone who was never, so they went through basic training, but they never got, I think they were drafted, but they only did basic, and they were never deployed in Vietnam. And the way, like, so they were like recounting stories of basic the same way I've heard people recount stories of, you know, well, my dad was also not deployed, but he enlisted, but he had a friend who got like 2 Purple Hearts and a gold, silver star for bravery, I think, or for valor or whatever. And hearing him talk about actual combat, or my friends who are actually in combat. My point is that World War I and World War II were so defining, especially World War II, for like all of the rest of U.S. history after that. And one of the things that it did is that there were like the people who were in the war went on to be the ones who led everything at one point. Like the majority of senators were former veterans. And so I think my point is that every generation has this desire they've heard the stories of the generation before them, and they want to have their version of that. And so the way I heard someone talking about basic training is the way I heard other people talk about actually being in war, but they wanted to be in touch with the struggles and the refining, what was it called? Like rites of passage of the past generations. Like those still have weight to them. And in a time where we don't have those rites of passage, I think people try to make those up. And I think there is an aspect to, and I could be totally wrong here, I know this might be controversial, where there could be people like that are Black in this generation that hear the stories of people, of real civil rights leaders and people who actually had that fight and that struggle. And the same way that there are people who want to tap into like the valor of their fathers and grandfathers who were in war, that they might want to tap into the heroic nature of Martin Luther King and the actual civil rights movement, and as their version of a rite of passage, because they have grandparents who lived in Jim Crow and who actually, they have the scars to show they've experienced it. And that could be some, I think there is something about just like generations and again, that rites of passage and tapping into your ancestors, that I think that could be part of it, where There are people who just want to have their version of that because it was so meaningful for the people that came before them. So my point is, I think it's a different thing for a lot of different people. And it's incredibly complex because of that. And I mean, we don't have, you guys could address or not address anything I said, but I just think there's a lot to it. It's more complicated than just one thing.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of that. There's also kind of that goes a little bit with the white guilt aspect, where it's like, I feel because I know my ancestors, although not mine in particular, and not most people who are white in America have this, but, it's possible that my ancestors did something wrong to your ancestors, and now I feel like I need to pay penance for that. So, that's a huge driving force for both sides. And I do agree with you, Truman. I actually do see why this is appealing for some people. Again, as sometimes a hero complex, but also, kind of like what you said, people, they need to have their generation's war. And, when we're born in a generation that has relatively little war, although, people our age, have seen it, obviously, you have to have something to rally around and proclaim that you've survived through effectively, and kind of have that be your story. I think that, in addition to, and one of the biggest reasons I want to push back against anti-racism in schools is when you tell your children, if you have children who are Black, if you tell your children every single person is out to get you, especially if they're in uniform, how terrifying of a reality that is. So if you're told that at a young age, a person of color and me can have the exact same interaction with a police officer who has the exact same intentions to just wave hi to me, and I'm like, oh, he's being nice, and wave hi to someone of color, and they say, oh, that was a microaggression against me. They're basically saying, oh, I'll get you eventually, or something like that. It's a completely different experience when you have those preconditions already set for you. So I think that's in a lot of people's minds, and that's what motivates them to fight back against this.
But it's also important to notice, like stuff like that literally happens all the time when race is not an issue. I mean, that could happen if Kevin, you were standing on the side of the road and Truman was on one side of the road and I was on the other, and you wave at Truman and Truman's like, hey, Kevin, and you wave at me, and maybe I don't know who you are and you look like a big burly guy, and I'm like, what the hell is he doing? Like that literally happens all the time when it has nothing to do with race. And I think that oftentimes people will assign race as the differentiating characteristic when it might have nothing to do with why you're perceiving the situation like you are.
Yeah. And I think the thought leaders of this type of movement know that. It's just they're kind of weaponizing that to say, oh, they're not, being nice to you. This because you're Black or because you're, a person of color or non-white, that these people are aggressing against you.
That could be a good transition to the. Go ahead, Karlyn. Sorry.
I was going to say, that just emphasizes again that this has nothing to do with race. This has nothing to do with justice. This has nothing to do with fairness. It only has to do with power. And these people will say anything they need to say in order to feel like the world is out to get you.
James, you should mute yourself, buddy.
Yeah,
I'm getting.
Sorry.
Yeah, got it. Awesome. Yeah, but that's I think the main point here is none of this is about the thing it claims to be about. Ironically, when you make everything about a power struggle, you're going to end up struggling for power because that's your only motivation, because you believe that's the only thing out there. I would argue that most people who buy into this don't believe that they're struggling for power. They're kind of following a bit of the leadership or a bit of the ideology, but the people at the top who actually know about this stuff understand what it's about. They understand that we need to spin everything to become a race narrative if we want it to be racist.
Yeah.
So I guess my way of trying to end this discussion or move toward action items that I think we should try to do at the end is, if the anti-racist types get their way, what does an anti-racist future look like? Does this deconstruction ever end? Do we get racial equity? Does language change? What does the First Amendment, kind of look like? Basically, what best represents this utopia or really dystopia we'd see in the future if critical race theory gets to run amok?
If these people get their way, there will be no First Amendment. The First Amendment will be gone. And maybe not practically, but functionally, it will be gone.
The understanding will be completely changed. Yeah.
And let's just be honest, the understanding is already kind of screwed up. And we could have the argument about like private company versus like one. You know, when you exist in a world where people are locked in their house and the only place they have to communicate is social media, then it becomes a broader discussion. Whatever. If these people get their way, it is going to fundamentally change our society in ways that are going to make us resemble communist China, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, the way I think about it is, and I think James Lindsay kind of expanded on this, is much like Marxism. There is no end game. There is no planned end game to this. Marxists, battled for the end by seizing the means of production, but that they found out that the end did not end there because all their problems were effectively amplified. All the problems they claimed to try to get rid of, and the same thing goes with the anti-racist types, at least the followers, that they think the end means the death of racism that manifests itself as racial equity. But the leaders know it will never end. Even after they gain absolute power, it will never end because that's the only way you can maintain power. But there is no end game.
Well, yeah. And if you look at Kennedy's work, everything, he even defines that everything is either racist or anti-racist. There is no conclusive state. There is no state where things are just neutral. There is no state where things are just as they are, which means there is no way for things to ever end. There will always be a tension, and it will always grow and grow, and there is no their use of definitions is so cyclical. It makes the entire theory, the entire practice and ideology also cyclical, self-creating and self-propagating.
Yeah, if this ideology wins, Karlyn, I agree, there would be no First Amendment. There would also be no Constitution. If whatever Constitution there was would be unrecognizable to what we have today. But the thing I think about more, and this is something maybe it's just because what I've been marinating in lately. My oldest friend on this earth blocked me the other day. I didn't even know, like, they didn't even follow me on Twitter, but they saw a tweet that I sent where I was, a little skeptical of BLM deserving a Nobel Peace Prize. And they like had tweeted and asked me, like, why do you think the way you do? And then they blocked me before I could respond. And I still sent them a texted message. But I mean, that's 30 years, down just because we disagree. So if this gets its way, it's the end of trust. It's the end of authentic relationships. Because here's the deal. The people who are pretending to buy into it are buying into a performative ideology where there isn't really anything authentic about it. You can't be authentic because authenticity requires pushback. Like, real friends are the ones who will tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. I think about this again, I think probably just because I was talking to a guy who's fighting this in an administrative level, in an international ministry. I talked to him for 3 hours the other day, but, he was talking about, okay, so if I am working with, a Black guy, and like, how much does this corrode trust and vulnerability in the relationship? I can't criticize him because I'll be perceived as racist. And he's always wondering if anything I do is because I'm a racist. And I'm always wondering if he's going to think I did something because it's racist. Like, it removes all trust. And the other races, so if you're Asian, it's like, what about me? Like, all this does is just generate the most resentful, calloused, hateful society we could possibly imagine. And I mean, it'd be like Jim Crow on steroids, man. I mean, it would be awful. And so that's what I think about, whatever happens on a government systemic level, the ways in which this will, erode our freedoms and erode our liberties. I also just think about our quality of life of the average person would be so low, that it would be just as bad as what happened in a governmental level, because there'd be no authenticity in their relationships. And those who did reject it, those who did try to say, no, we don't want to be part of this, there's going to be one part of those people that probably try to create a white ethno state or something, because they're making racists right now. You bet your ass they are. So that's the one thing. And then the other, whatever minority are going to be like, tribalist Israel out wandering the desert. Like, what do we do? Like, where do we go? Because we're not going to bend the knee, as you said appropriately. So where do we go? I mean, it just destroys our social fabric. It destroys our ability to trust and relate to each other. And as a result, it destroys commerce. It destroys markets. It destroys property ownership. I mean, it destroys everything that creates an actual civilized society. And by doing that, it'll allow the worst people to seize the reins of power so that they could try to bring some order to the chaos. One of Hoffer's observations is that a society with a lot of equality, like forced equality and very little freedom, is much more stable than a society with like a lot of freedom, but very little equality, because freedom creates inequalities is his point. And inequalities create unrest, and unrest, people push back. So he's like, even the most fascist society oftentimes is more stable than a place with a lot of freedom. And so, like, whatever you think about that, I think I'm not calling for fascism, obviously, but I'm saying the people who would be able to bring some order into that chaos and some stability by, forcing equality, forcing, that equality of outcomes. And as you pointedly observed, Kevin, I think, or Karlyn, that there's a reason why it never has an end goal, is because the thing they're chasing doesn't exist. At least the thing they claim to be chasing. The power they get in the name of chasing it, very tangible, good stuff. But that power is ostensibly as a means to acquire this end that they can never reach. So they just end up in a state of power indefinitely. But that's what I think happens. I mean, we just completely crumble on a social level, and just the hatred and resentment and the fear will create the worst possible outcome, both on a personal level and on a governmental level. So that's an optimistic picture.
Yeah. So, I mean, well, this is a think tank, so this kind of raises the question then, what kind of, I guess, principles would outline a way for a free society to avoid this type of situation, or at least mitigate it?
Yeah, I mean, that's James, you already hopped right into what I was about to get into, kind of the action items at the end, because like you said, the think tank needs to have something actionable, or it's just a bunch of people having conversations. So at least for me, the biggest fight for me, because personally it touches my life, is fighting back in schools. So I actually have, a school meeting tomorrow on this stuff via Zoom, and it's a little, I even had to talk to my fiance to make sure she's okay with me speaking up, because of, the repercussions it can have on our daughter in school, and then kids looking at her different, and, making claims just because I'm pushing back against something. I don't know. In the very, very progressive town I live in, if I'm really going to have much support in that pushback, but, I'm going to try as much as I can. But I think one of the best tools I have against pushing back is I could go in there with How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi and just read from it like kindergarten style, and read quotes from that book, and then stop to explain what those quotes mean. So, like, I have an example here of a quote that is the most disgusting quote in the book. And it's kind of technically two quotes put together, but I'm not misrepresenting anything here. And it's, the defining question is whether discrimination is creating equity or inequity. If discrimination is creating equity, then it's anti-racist. If discrimination is creating if discrimination is creating equity, then it's anti-racist. If discrimination is creating inequity, then it's racist. The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. He's openly advocating for discrimination. So my first question, I know in that phone call, is going to be, do you guys like discrimination? Is it something you want that you're up for? Because, anti-racist is in this name. And if these guys are following the anti-racist narratives of people like Kendi, this is what you want. So we need to understand from the thought leaders themselves exactly what they want to do. And you go back to the thought leaders of earlier of critical race theory. I mean, they're against liberalism. They're just listing all the problems out with that. They're against the First Amendment. They're against all of these things that they say end in racial inequity, that they will tear the whole system apart. And these people, I mean, these unfortunate parents who don't have the time to do all the studying and reading and podcasting and creating content like we all get to do, they're not going to see this coming. So I think the best way I know for me in my personal capacity to push back is starting in the schools. And then I know some of you have different avenues. I know Karlyn, you did a great job a couple of days ago, and I would appreciate if you talk a bit about that because you're also making real change.
Yeah, so I live in New Hampshire, and Donald Trump, when he was president, issued 2 executive orders that banned critical race theory training in the federal government and in all federal government contractors. As soon as Joe Biden got into office, he rescinded those executive orders. So now millions of people and millions of taxpayer dollars are going to be spent on critical race training yet again. But it doesn't necessarily need to be that way, because the states have the option to ban it on a state level. And when I mean banning it, I don't mean banning it from being discussed. I mean, we have freedom of speech. You can discuss any ideas you want, but that doesn't mean that our states and our governments should be taking our taxpayer dollars to force individuals to go through these types of trainings where they very literally, what happens in these trainings is that white people are separated out from the audience. And in New Hampshire, trust me, there are a lot of white people in New Hampshire. And they are forced to admit that they are racist, and they are forced to apologize for their inherent racism. And if they don't do these things, they could lose their jobs, point blank. If they say, I do not believe that I am a racist, then they could very literally lose their jobs under this training. So what's going on in New Hampshire, and other states are trying to do it, is that a bill has been introduced on the state level to ban critical race theory from people who are contracting with the state who want to take state money. And the things that it bans, I mean, to the question of like, how do you answer the question of if you're a racist? Well, if you look at the bill, some of the things that it bans are teaching people that one race is inherently superior to another race. That is an incredibly racist concept, and that is what the bill is banning. Another thing it might ban is teaching people that they are inherently racist based on the color of their skin when they were born. That's an inherent, like, if you are in favor of teaching people that they are racist simply because they're white, that is a fundamentally racist concept. And I mean, this is really point blank. And how I described it in the testimony I wrote to give in the New Hampshire House of Representatives to the committee hearing where this is right now. What I said is, like, the easiest way to understand critical race theory is this. Martin Luther King Jr. famously said that we should judge people based on the content of their character rather than on the color of their skin. Critical race theory does exactly the opposite of that. It says that the most important thing that we should judge people on is the color of their skin, not the content of their character. And so if someone asks you if you're a racist, well, you know what I would answer with? I believe in the same words that Martin Luther King Jr. spoke, which is, I think that people should be judged based on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. I think that's what I'm trying to do, and I don't believe that this ideology does that.
Perfectly put. Truman, you got something?
Well, I think I was just listening to, I was just kind of a bit caught up in what Karlyn said, because I totally agree. I think, so if we're talking like action items, right? I was thinking about, like, what's the smallest thing a person could do, because people don't want to do this, people don't want to do the homework and all this other stuff. And that's fine, I guess, for most people, but they're like, okay, what's the smallest step I can take in fighting this? And I just think about what does no look like on a practical level in your life? Like, I think that in that audio essay I wrote, I talked about, how this thing seems like an unstoppable force and we have to be immovable objects in its way. And so, like, I don't know what it looks like, because not everyone's going to go to those meetings. They should. Parents should know and should care enough to do it. Not everyone's going to go speak at their state House of Representatives. That'd be cool if they could. And I think it's awesome that is happening. And so we want to do whatever it looks like to empower the people that are being the most vocal and standing up the most. But I think also just for people to have just some practical in their mind of, like, for me, I just think about, like, what does it look like for you to manifest the concept of no in the face of this stuff? And so people don't like, everyone knows what that looks like in their own individual lives. It could be, I have this, because again, this is everywhere. Like Burt Weinstein said, I don't know where this isn't. So, it's everywhere. So there's no one that's going to go, I have no idea how I could manifest no, because I don't have any interaction with this. Like, of course I do. So, I think that's an important thing. And I think the other thing is really fighting hard to find points of contact of commonality with those that you perceive are good faith actors in this. So some of people are the ones who are going to shut down and are, totally drank the Kool-Aid, and that's fine. Like you only have so much time and emotional energy to invest in things. But there are people that, you can find that you have good faith interactions with. And if you perceive that, then I would say fight really hard to find commonality with them, to find common ground with them, to see if you can, potentially make a convert to someone who at least is willing to ask questions of this stuff, And so, yeah, I think the way that this happens, the way things change is, like what we talked about earlier, most people are just kind of silent. Like it's a very vocal minority. It's a growing minority, but it's a very vocal minority that's doing this. And the absence of doubt or the absence of any type of pushback or any type of contrary thought is what makes it seem so powerful. So I think for people to just realize, like, just manifesting no or asking questions is incredibly powerful, because what that does is it breaks the illusion of consensus. This thing enjoys a massively fabricated illusion of consensus, mostly due to our, garbage people at the legacy establishment media and the tech companies they've gotten in bed with. But they've created a sense of consensus by platforming and celebrating the loudest, craziest voices. And then anyone who does dare speak up by silencing them. And so I think by people just, again, saying no and asking questions of, wait, so why would we want to advocate for segregation, or why would we want to do this, or sharing articles, with people that you think, again, might be good, good faith and operating in good faith. I think by doing that at that personal, like, grassroots level, I think is one of the best ways to facilitate change. Like, I think about it like everyone has their social circles, right? There's all these people that their lives overlap with. And, the perception, what's that saying? You are, the amalgam of like the 10 people you are closest with, or that you spend the most time with, or something like that. And if you have right now, what we have is people look around at all of their social circles and they see this artificial consensus, or, this artificial sense of, well, I guess everyone else, agrees with this, or something like that. And the more people within their social circles that are like, yeah, I don't know about that, and are willing to hold their ground whenever the bad faith actors call them racist. Like, you got to get over being called racist. Now, if you are racist and deserve it, you should probably think about that. But if you're not, you got to get over being called a racist, any more than if someone called you a murderer. It's like, well, I don't kill people, so that doesn't make sense. Like, you have to be, steel-spined in that regard, because that will happen. But yeah, understanding their social landscape is going to change, but there are going to be people that they could reach out to and build commonality with, which changes the way those social circles are perceived. And it breaks the spell of artificial consensus, which allows doubt to become something that can be injected into the narrative. Doubt is doubt's an anathema to this ideology. The minute doubt becomes normalized, then we win. This thing wins because no one's even allowed to express doubt. So if we could normalize doubt, normalize no, and just manifesting no in the ways that it's appropriate for you, then I think that's the most practical way that the average person can do that. I don't know does that make sense?
Absolutely.
I think one of the best ways that people could do that is actually through humor. Just being able to make jokes, I think, is one of the best ways to kind of take away the tension and the power that all these words, all these insults, and also these ideologies are able to hold. If you're able to make a joke about it, it kind of takes away the sacred aspect of it. We were talking about how this is kind of seen as a religion. Well, one of the things about religion is you can't defile them, but with jokes you're able to sort of make things defileable. And you can do it in a way that's somewhat tasteful, or even if it's not necessarily tasteful, you can do it in a way that's not going to make people entirely blow up. So I think for the average person, if you're hearing some stuff like that, some of this CRT related stuff, you could basically just make some jokes and be able to play it off as something that doesn't require or that shouldn't be taken as seriously as these people are taking it. I think that's probably one of the best things to do. But it is a little difficult because, like we were saying, this is kind of core to people make this kind of belief system core to who they are. They make it, they like bind it with their soul in a way. And getting past that, getting through that barrier is definitely, it's tough to overcome. And I think one of the big issues is it's reinforced through a lot of places where people work, where people shop and do all this stuff. And it really is kind of incumbent on people to say, I'm not going to do business with people who do this, because this type of ideology, it's a very like, in a way, it's un-American because it's not treating people equally. It's not treating people, it's not treating people equally, or that we were all born free. All this, like, it has all these preconceptions as to how people are born into their skin. So there does need to be that pushback, even in just a small way. Like after the critical gender stuff with Gillette, I stopped buying their razors. Just small stuff like that, stuff that hurts the bottom line in institutions.
Yeah, but it's really important that it's not enough to just not buy their razors. You have to tell them. You have to tell them, here is why I'm no longer buying your razors. And this is really, like, it sounds like a simple thing, but this is the step that people skip over most often, because organizations have entire processes for dealing with customer complaints. I know, I mean, in places I've been in, literally every single, like for example, I worked for a public radio station that every time someone emailed in a complaint to the public radio station, it got put in a folder. And once a month, it went around to every single director in the organization, and we all had to read them, and we all had to account for every single one of the complaints. The complaints always come from one side. They always come from the left. And so if the only places that are here, if the only people that these organizations are hearing from are people on the left saying, we demand you do this critical race nonsense, and they never hear from people on the right that are saying, I'm not going to buy your stuff anymore because you're doing this critical race nonsense, they're going to make decisions based on who they're hearing from. That's
a really good point. And yeah, I think, James, what you said about the humor is spot on, in that, you know, humor is basically dead. This is something I've been thinking about for a while. And it really breaks my heart because, you know, comedy and stand-up comedy and jokes was just such a big part of just my growth and development as a young dude. Like, I loved stand-up comedy so much. And to see it kind of dying the way it is really sad. And, you know, to what you said, I think I posted something, it might've been in Dave's, I don't know, about how the late night and SNL and them were having to adjust to a post-Trump era. And my point was, well, if you're actually doing comedy, there is no adjustment. You just keep making jokes, but that's not what they're doing. And I think the thing I said at the end is you don't ridicule what you worship. And so, like, I think that's why a lot of these people are incapable of doing that. But the people who aren't at that stage yet of worshiping this ideology and so on, I think it's good for them to see it, you know, being ridiculed, because here's the deal. It is ridiculous. Like, Ryan Long had that whole sketch where he was pretending to be the guy who was like running these campaigns for the Democratic nominees. And he was just feeding them trolly nonsense ideas. And he's like, I can't believe they believe this. Like, you know, and the joke is, these ideas are so absurd, you would imagine that they're only coming from someone who's trolling. Like, segregation in the name of unity is such a patently ridiculous idea that it is funny, but it's less funny because they're serious about it. But it's like, if you eat, just having the demeanor of ridicule, because and not the people necessarily, like if you're trying to make a connection with a person, you don't want to ridicule them and say, haha, you're a dumbass. But what you can say is, yeah, dude, I mean, do what you want to do, but I just don't think segregation in the name of racial unity makes a whole lot of sense. But if, hey, more power to you, I would only ask that you report back to me on what a glowing success that was, after this whole civil rights thing we had that kind of showed that it didn't work out so hot. But maybe they'll get it right the second time. I don't know. But I think just doing that and having that attitude of I'm not going to take this as seriously as you do. I'm going to be serious about my opposition to it, but I can use humor to do that. I think it does knock it down a peg or two. And I think also just anything that throws this thing off its game. That's why I like the lens of emotional abuse. It's not something it's accustomed to having to engage with. So I've seen it throw people off. I think humor does the same thing. Anything that can throw them off of wait a second, I'm not used to this. What do you okay, here's the best example. Think about it in the first Guardians of the Galaxy, right? At the end, whenever, the guy's about to do the thing and then Peter Quill is trying to get him to do a dance off, and singing and the bad guy just freezes, right? He's just what are you doing? What is this? And he doesn't know what to do. And there is a nugget of truth there in the fact that humor, and it's if you're trying to intimidate me or threaten me and I'm smiling, something's not going according to your plan, right? It's the same reason why, if any kid that ever made the mistake of whenever their parent was spanking them, showing the parent that it didn't hurt, and laughed or whatever, it's oh yeah, is that all you got? The parent isn't expecting that, but I think that's a good way to throw kind of a wrench, into what they're doing. So I think that's a really good observation. And to what you said, Karlyn, just another example of that, there's a few people that I went to college with that are in full-time ministry, and their salary is support. They get donations from people. And I was talking to a friend who asked me if I was wanted to support him and what he was doing just in December. And I realized we need to think about if we want to continue to give this ministry. And we came to the conclusion that the people that we give to, it wouldn't hurt them as much of us not giving to them as it would help for us to let this organization know and let them know this is why we're not giving to you. It's not that we don't support what you're doing, but we can't sign off on what this organization's doing. And that was actually really meaningful to the people that I talked to. And I've been working on how to draft a letter to the organization proper, but they're saying why is absolutely important. Adding another voice there, so it's not the only ones criticizing are the left people, but there's malcontents, who have legitimate grievances on the other side as well.
And there's actually another step that people can take with this, is because not just tell them why you're no longer doing business with them. If you're working for a company that starts to implement these types of trainings, get your resume out there to go to other places. And the second you have something else lined up, when HR asks you why you left, you can say exactly why you left. When your boss asks you why you left, you can say exactly why you left. If you're a manager or a leader, all the more power. Send out an email to your team. This is why I'm leaving.
Yeah, I think that is a really, really astute point, James. And to be frank, don't even wait for people to ask you. I think the last point you made about if you manage people, send out an email to your team. I am leaving because of reason X, Y, B, and Z. And I think anyone can do that. You don't have to be a manager of a team to send out. I mean, listen, most people in most organizations can email the entire flipping staff list. If they want to send out an email to the entire staff saying, deuces, this is why.
Yep.
You don't need permission at that point. And then just go.
And even if you are a more conservative person, you don't like to put yourself out there too much. I mean, at that point, once you've already have your next job lined up, you can do that to really just be okay, you have your security there. You don't have to worry about losing your job for making your statements. You can just actually make your statements on the way out. So it's a little bit more secure. I know a lot of people get nervous about the harm that can come from it, but being able to be straightforward like that is important.
Yeah, and I think to circle back real quick to Truman's point about, humor and comedy dying, I think humor is going to die when truth dies. Because just as the saying goes, the court jester is the only person who can speak the truth in the king's court. I think that's the truth. And that's why comedy is such I think you and I have talked offline about this before. The impact of comedy is massive, especially in today's culture. And, I say like sports is kind of the same way. And there's a couple of different institutions that are like that if we think it's entertainment, but once you get rid of it, you'll understand that, the republic will fall within 5 years, probably, if we would do that. So that is an important indication, when it comes to when you're getting canceled because of a humorous thing that's maybe can be spun as offensive, but it clearly wasn't made out of the point of offense. That's when, you start to have a sick culture that needs to be corrected. So good point. And if that's really it with you guys, I think that was a good conversation. And real quick, let's just go around and kind of plug your stuff. Karlyn, if you want to go first, where can people find you?
Yes, they can find me on lots of places. They can find me on YouTube, and they can find me on Locals, kb.locals.com. Twitter, Gab, Minds, all the rest, and I will soon be on Rothkin as well, which I'm very excited about.
Nice. And real quick, you do have a conversation coming up with James Lindsay, right?
Yeah. So okay. So I got asked yesterday to do a 3-way with James Lindsay and Benjamin Boyce, and how can I say no to that?
Nice.
Very cool.
We'll put it that way.
Beautiful.
Make sure not to throw a lady dick in that 3-way. All right, Truman, where can people find you?
Vomiting in a minute. I have a Locals, returntoreason.locals.com, YouTube, return to reason, ThinkSpot, return to reason, Twitter, My Mundane Mind, Medium, return to reason. You can find all my stuff there. I'm going to actually start putting out, I've got some stuff coming up that I'm excited about. We'll see. But yeah, that's where you can find it.
Awesome, man. James?
All right. I am commutationconstruct.locals.com. And you can also find me on Minds and Gab and Medium at James Darian, and on Twitter at CommutationC. We'll have links for the spellings.
Awesome. All right. And I'm Kevin from Engineering Politics. You can go to engineeringpolitics.locals.com to find and support me there. I'm also on YouTube, Twitter, and I think that's about it for me now, because I used to have a Parler account, but I hear that doesn't exist anymore. So it's basically everywhere you can find me. But for everyone listening, thank you for listening to this conversation. This is the Ember Roundtable, and see you next time.
Peace.
Later, everyone.